anticipating Wendy's old-fashioned hamburgers restaurant. Hand me my glasses.
Look who Jamie brings home.
Hello.
But when your video heads get dirty, you lose your picture.
Captain Adams VHS Pirate Ship presents the hammerfilms Halloween Spectacular. Starring Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Ingrid Pitts, Ralph Bates, Valerie Leon, and many more. And now, wearing a gorilla mask for his Halloween costume because he's too lazy to think of something else, Captain Adams.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Ahoy there, mates. Welcome aboard the VHS Pirate Ship. Happy Halloween. And welcome to the Hammer Films Halloween Spectacular. Yes, it's a great show we have planned for you tonight. It's very exciting. Halloween, very exciting time here on the VHS Pirate Ship. We're all very much looking forward to it. Little Creep especially, and he's decided to dress up as Tim Curry from The Worst Witch, a very underrated Halloween special. And some say it's the prequel to The Craft. Well, I don't know about all that, but it is very interesting to watch and not as bad as people would have you believe. And well, since he's a big fan and he's very excited for Halloween, he wanted to do something very special for all of you out there tonight. I know he's been working very hard on it. He really wants to show not only how much he appreciates Halloween, but also how much he appreciates you, the viewer. So without further ado, here's Little Creep with his rendition of Anything Can Happen on Halloween. Ladies and gentlemen, Little Creep.
I wouldn't change places with anyone tonight. We'll carve pumpkin faces and watch the demons' flight. Every human heart will shudder. Every soul will shake with fear. Tonight, the creepiest. Tonight, the scariest. Tonight, the most wonderful night of the year. Anything could happen on Halloween. Your dog could turn into a cat. There may be a toad in your bass guitar, or your sister could turn into a bat. Christmas time brings the snow, summertime brings the sun, but on Halloween, your blood begins to run. Something spooky's going down. Anything can happen on Halloween. It's better than a video. Rimmond's gonna mess up every cassette from London to Idaho. April 1st can be fun. New Year's Eve is a bore. But on Halloween, your flesh begins to crawl. Oh, I'm losing control!
Okay, that's enough. Yes, it's Halloween time. Once again, it's spooky season, and that means horror movies. And when it comes to that, the choices are basically unlimited. You have plenty of eras to choose from. You got your postmodern, your modern, your classical, your golden era, all kinds of stuff. And those eras have their own categories. You got your slasher movies, your spooky movies, your monster movies. Now, I myself prefer monster movies because I like having a memorable character to tie into a spooky story. And when it comes to monster movies, there is a plethora, a litany, a bevy, a cacophony, if you will. You have plenty of choices for that. And of course, you have your four main monsters. You know, the four most popular monster archetypes. Your Dracula, your Frankenstein's monster, your mummy, your wolfman. These monstrosity typical are very well represented on film because these archetypal monsters are very memorable, and there's been a version of them on film ever since cinema was invented. There have been plenty of representations of these monsters in many forms in many films, but really, there's only a few that people remember. Yes, there are certainly those that stand out more than others, and when you're in a casual conversation with your average Joe on the street, that conversation usually goes like this.
Oh man, Dracula's my favorite. You can't beat Bela Lugosi. But who was the other Dracula? Who was that guy?
Or they might say something like this.
Oh, Frankenstein's gotta be my favorite. Boris Karloff is just fabulous, but who was the other one?
Now, that's just a mild synopsis on how those conversations typically go. The Universal Pictures versions of these monsters have to be the most well-known, but there is a runner-up. Yes, there are other, almost as famous versions of these monsters, but by who? Yes, it's a studio that made its own versions of these classic monster movies, and it's a studio that most of us know, but not very well. Not even well enough to know what to call it, and I myself didn't know till just a few years ago. So here we have a studio that made monster movies that are almost, if not on the same cultural impact level as Universal Pictures. And yet, we never bothered even learning their name. Well, what am I talking about? It's Hammerfilms. And what is that? Are they films about hammers? No. Films made by hammers? No. Films that have anything to do with MC Hammer? No. Then what is it? Hammerfilms, or Hammer Films Productions, is a British film production company based in London, England. Founded in 1934, they would go on to be a very prevalent production studio which added to the evolution of cinema. Though their repertoire encompasses all genres of film, they are synonymous with horror movies, to the extent that most people assume that's all they did. But in reality, Hammer Films did a grand total of 158 films, with only 50 of which being regarded as horror. And those 50 are pretty much the ones that everybody focuses on. But they also did a lot of mysteries, dramas, and even a couple musical comedies, with a good old adventure film thrown in here and there. But of course, Hammer Films would be best known for making horror movies, but they didn't start making those until 1955, with the sci-fi horror flick, The Quatermass Experiment, which was released in the States as The Creeping Unknown, which could also describe that rash you have. You know the one. This movie was a tremendous box office success and would breathe new life into Hammer Films, which had been previously floundering. They knew they were on to something special, so they decided to follow that up with another sci-fi horror movie, X the Unknown, in 1956. And this was yet another box office success, but in 1957, everything would change dramatically. For the better, of course, with the release of their first horror movie filmed in color, The Curse of Frankenstein, which was released in theaters May 2nd, 1957. And the Hammer Films Frankenstein fever would not stop with simply one movie, as they would continue to make 6 other Frankenstein films, giving them a grand total of 7 Frankenstein movies. There was The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958, The Evil of Frankenstein in 1964, Frankenstein Created Woman in 1967, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed in 1969, The Horror of Frankenstein from 1970, and this is the only Hammer Films Frankenstein movie to not feature Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein. Yeah, for whatever reason, he didn't do this one. Instead, it was Ralph Bates. And finally, there's Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell from 1974, and this film and the previous film featured David Prowse as the monster, and of course, he was the guy in the Darth Vader get-up in the Star Wars movies. Now, I've already discussed all of these films in the episode Finding Frankenstein Movies, which is in the archives if you wanted to check that out, and I suggest you do so. Not now, geez, finish watching this episode first. Now, Hammerfilms became known for doing their own versions of monster movies that Universal Pictures had already covered. But the Hammerfilms versions are widely different and vastly ghastly. Yeah, some of these films can get downright gruesome at times. In fact, when they were first released, most of them got X ratings. So if you watch these movies now, you might be like, well, geez, that's a little hyperbolic, because they're really not all that bad, but they were cutting edge for the time. So Hammerfilms did their own thing when it came to the Universal Pictures monster tropes, but they're also known for doing a variety of other monster movies that seemingly came out of nowhere. Movies that aren't exactly as well known as they probably should be. And today, we're going to explore these movies and the expanse of the Hammerfilms horror library. So get ready to be hit in the face with some late 50s to early 70s British horror movies, because it's today's adventure,
The Hammerfilms Halloween Spectacular.
The great Hammerfilms, a studio that would be tremendously successful, and yet many people don't know their name. Even though their versions of the monster movies that Universal Pictures had previously made famous are almost just as famous as those, people would still refer to them as the British versions. And I mean, they're not wrong with that description, but the studio does have a name, and as we've established, it's Hammerfilms. And as we've also established, Hammerfilms took their first bite out of the horror movie pie with the Quartermass experiment. And also, we've established that film was released in the States as The Creeping Unknown. But when it was released on VHS in the US, it reverted back to its original title. And that release, by the way, didn't come until 1996, when MGM/UA Home Video finally decided to release it. And MGM would release it again in 2000 as part of their Midnight Movie Series. And what is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, actually, I'm not glad you asked, because that's a loaded topic and really one that deserves its own episode. And I'll do one in the future, but for now, just know that in the year 2000, MGM bought the rights to a metric shit ton of movies that could be considered B-movies or schlock. And speaking of home video distributors, you're going to notice throughout the course of this episode that the Hammerfilms horror movies on video are sort of all over the place. Which is odd, because typically a major studio has its own home video subsidiary, and if it doesn't, it usually relies on one company to release all of their movies. But Hammerfilms is an exception to this rule because, well, Warner Brothers has some, Anchor Bay has some, MGM has some. It's just, you know, you're gonna have to catch as catch can here. And since I brought up Anchor Bay, it's important to note that in 1999, they were host to the only VHS distribution for the second Hammerfilms horror movie, X the Unknown. And in my opinion, Hammerfilms does not get the credit it deserves for its contributions to the movie monster world. And yeah, I know they got Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, even Phantom of the Opera, but I'm not talking about those. Those are all great too. But I'm talking about stuff like the monster from X the Unknown, which, in case you were wondering, was a giant gelatinous radioactive blob. And this was released in 1956. 2 years before the famous movie, The Blob. So as far as flesh-eating blobs go, Hammerfilms was ahead of the curve. As I mentioned earlier, 1957 was a big year for Hammerfilms because that's when they released their first colorized horror movie, The Curse of Frankenstein. But not only did they release that, they also released Quartermass 2, the roundabout sequel to the Quartermass experiment. And once again, Anchor Bay would be the only distributor to put this on VHS. That is, US VHS release, and this wasn't until 1999. Just like X the Unknown, this didn't get a VHS release until 7 years before the fall of the VHS empire. Yeah, like I said, Hammer stuff on VHS is kind of weird. A lot of the films in their horror library didn't get VHS releases until 1999 or later. Oh, and by the way, Quartermass 2 was released in U.S. theaters under the name Enemy from Space. Again, 1957 was a pivotal year for Hammer Films because they didn't just release 2 horror films, they released 3. The third one being The Abominable Snowman, which was released in theaters August 26, 1957, and is one of the very few movies that features a Yeti as the main monster. Once again, Hammer Films being ahead of the curve, and this was a very original movie and very well received. It's a very well done movie, and I guess the people were just ready for a movie about the Abominable Snowman. Oh, I'm so ready for a Yeti. I love a movie about a Yeti. I love a Yeti. I want to eat spaghetti with a Yeti. I want to fish with a Yeti off a jetty and call him Eddie. So there you go. This movie was very original for its time and still pretty original today. And if you're tired of the old monster movie tropes, give this one a shot. You'll be impressed. It's definitely different and certainly another stunning Peter Cushing performance. So if you're tired of the old vampires, zombies, and werewolf movies and you're ready for a Yeti, give this movie a shot. And by the way, this was released in the U.S. as The Abominable Snowman of the Himalayas, which to me is a bit redundant because I've always thought it was assumed that the Abominable Snowman was from the Himalayas, and therefore stating his location is a bit unnecessary. It would be different if the Abominable Snowman was somewhere else, like the Abominable Snowman of Wilmington, Delaware. But anyways, it was released on VHS as simply The Abominable Snowman, which was in 1999 by Anchor Bay. Yes, it's yet another Hammer Films horror movie released by Anchor Bay in 1999. You might be asking yourself, what's up with that? Well, in 1999, Anchor Bay released a little mini collection of Hammer films that weren't previously on VHS, or at least US releases, and this was simply called the Hammer Collection. They all came in these sleek little clamshells, and it was nice. Moving on, Hammer Films wouldn't always use untapped monster resources for their monster movies, such as radioactive blobs or Abominable Snowman. They would also use, as present in The Curse of Frankenstein, the typical monster tropes. And these typical monster tropes would of course include vampires, but not just any vampires, the vampire, Dracula. And in 1958, Hammer Films would give us the movie that they're pretty much best known for, Dracula, which was released in the States as The Horror of Dracula, which I'm assuming was an effort to separate it from the Universal Pictures Dracula. And this film would feature Christopher Lee in quite possibly one of his most iconic roles. You know, right up there with Saruman, Count Dooku, and that scientist from Gremlins 2. Okay, that last one, that's hit or miss. The Hammer Films Dracula, or Horror of Dracula, if you want to call it that, would go on to be almost as popular as the Universal Pictures Dracula, if not just as popular. And there was always 2 different camps when it came to this. It was like those 2 different Voltron cartoons, remember those? It was a matter of opinion on which film was better, and though both of these movies are based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, they are both very different movies. And the Hammer Films Dracula, as is the case of any of their monster trope Universal counterparts, is way more ghastlier. Yeah, as I had mentioned in the beginning of this episode, Hammer Films became known for being far more ghoulish with their monster movies. And Dracula is no exception. Neither is the 7 other Dracula movies they made. And no, I'm not including the 1974 horror martial arts extravaganza, The Legend of the 7 Golden Vampires, because it has nothing to do with Dracula, and I know the Brides of Dracula from 1960 doesn't really either, but at least they talk about Dracula in that movie. So yes, there was a grand total of 8 Hammer Films Dracula movies. Much like Frankenstein, Dracula would prove to be quite the money-making franchise for Hammer Films. I mean, hey, Dracula is quite possibly the most popular movie monster, tied only with Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster. Hammer Films could not get enough Dracula movies, and neither could the audience. There was The Brides of Dracula in 1960, which I already mentioned, and this is the only Hammer Films Dracula movie not to feature Christopher Lee as Count Dracula, or really even feature Count Dracula at all. Because like I said, he's not in this movie, but he is part of the story. Then Christopher Lee would come back in 1966 for Dracula, Prince of Darkness. And in 1968, Dracula's at it again with Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. And there's an important side note here, or at least a vaguely interesting one, that in Australia, the first couple of Dracula Hammer movies were banned. And this movie was the first one to pass censors and was released in Australia. Hammer Films had quite a reputation. Most of their movies were released with X ratings in the UK, and some countries didn't even allow them at all. But anyways, if at this point you're starting to get a little sick of Hammerfilms Dracula movies, well, it should be known that Christopher Lee was as well. And it certainly didn't help that in 1970, Hammer thought it was a good idea to release not one, but two other Dracula movies. There was Taste the Blood of Dracula. Oh God, that's a pretty gross title, especially for 1970. And Hammer Films wasn't just good at making ghastly monster movies, they were also really good at naming them. And this is the movie where Christopher Lee basically said, no, I don't want to be Dracula anymore, for heaven's sake. He was so reluctant that the original script didn't even have Dracula in it. It was some other vampire. But Hammer Films producers just had to have Lee as Dracula, so the script was changed, and voila, Christopher Lee is once again Dracula. And certainly not for the last time, because 1970 would also see the release of Scars of Dracula. I'm sorry, Scarves of Dracula? No, Scars. Oh, those Scarves of Dracula would be a pretty interesting movie, I guess. And Scars of Dracula confused a lot of audience members because it doesn't really have much to do with the other Dracula movies. Like there's no continuity really there. And it was described as dull and garish, gory junk. Now to me, I don't know how you could be both dull and garish, but it is what it is. And by this time, Christopher Lee was pretty fed up with being Dracula. But that didn't really matter because Hammer Films didn't seem to really give a shit. And we got Dracula, AD 1972, which was released in, well, 1972. Its working title, and I'm not sure if it was intended to be called this, was Dracula Today, which sounds like a talk show. Good morning, Transylvania, most of Romania, some of Hungary, and some of the UK. It's Dracula Today. And here's your host, talking about what matters most, Count Dracula. Hello and welcome to Dracula Today. I'm Count Dracula, and today we're going to be talking to Bishop Desmond Tutu about the latest UN peace accords, and later on, Wolfgang Puck's going to stop by to show us his famous pigs in a blanket recipe, so be sure to stay tuned. Man, I'm glad they didn't go with that title, but it really wouldn't have mattered because there's not much helping this movie. This is revered as the worst Hammer Films Dracula movie, and Christopher Lee absolutely despised it. Well, there's a lot to despise here because this movie is pretty awful. It was universally panned as being a pile of dog shit, and what didn't help is the fact that it was marketed as sort of a horror comedy. It's not a horror comedy. It was supposed to be a serious horror movie and, you know, revered as a Dracula movie and supposed to be serious and scary and ooh. But all the while, it had taglines like past, present, or future. Never count out the count. And welcome back, Drac. I mean, that's just rubbish. That's certainly not how you build a Dracula flick. Well, it got a little better in 1973 with the release of The Satanic Rites of Dracula. I told you about those Hammer Films titles. This is a pretty loaded one. I mean, it's right up there with Frankenstein and The Monster from Hell. But anyways, this title was almost not a thing. It was almost called Dracula is Dead and well and living in London. I mean, what a stupid name. It's a horrible idea. That title was supposed to be a play on a French musical called Jacques Brel is Alive and Well and Living in Paris, which was a comedic musical, which makes even less sense to name your Dracula movie after that. And if you thought that Christopher Lee was sick and tired of being Dracula before now, well, when he heard about the movie's title, he almost refused to do the film and made such a stink that they changed the title. So it was promptly changed to The Satanic Rites of Dracula. However, this title would prove to be a little bit too much for U.S. distributors, and this film wasn't released in the U.S. until 1979 under Count Dracula and His Vampire Bride. And this would be a heavily edited version of the film, not to mention released 6 years after its initial release. That's just weird. And international film distribution can be kind of strange. So that's all the Hammer Films Draculas. And speaking of strange, you might be wondering why I didn't mention Bram Stoker's Count Dracula from 1970, which features Christopher Lee as Dracula, but there's one problem. It's not a Hammer film. And this strikes me as strange because this was released in 1970, like I said, which was in the middle of all the Hammer Films Dracula movies. And it's weird that Lee would do this one, considering, well, he was already contracted to Hammer Films for all the other Dracula movies. And not to mention, the rumor has it, as I've said in this episode so far, he's been pretty sick and tired of playing Dracula. I can understand him gritting and bearing it and forcing himself to do the other Hammer Films Dracula movies, even though he hated them. But this, it's a studio that came out of nowhere nowhere and asked him to do a Dracula flick, and he said yes? That's strange. Now, this never had a U.S. theatrical release, but it was released in 1970, as I said, and that's why a lot of people thought it was a hammerfilms film there. Yeah, the international audience just assumed this was another hammerfilms Dracula flick, but it wasn't. Now, this movie does set itself apart by featuring a mustached Dracula. Yeah, Dracula with a mustache is something that we hadn't seen since John Carradine's portrayal of the Count. And we don't typically associate Dracula with mustaches, which is odd considering that all the Dracula hullabaloo is based on the 1897 novel by Bram Stoker, wherein it briefly describes Dracula as having a mustache, meaning that Count Dracula as a character was always intended to have a mustache. But for whatever reason, filmmakers decided that Dracula with a mustache just didn't work very well, which is why the Sans mustache Dracula is the most famous, and of course the best example of this would be the Bela Lugosi portrayal of the character, which is the clean-cut, smooth as silk version of the Count. Count Smooth. Well, novel-to-film adaptations usually have a lot of chopping blocks involved, and for some reason, a character's facial hair is one of the first things to go. For example, the novel of Jurassic Park features one of the main characters, Alan Grant, as having a big old beard. However, the film adaptation features the character without a beard. I mean, what gives here? They didn't think the world was ready for Sam Neill with a beard? I was. But anyways, on its face, all puns intended, the concept of Dracula with a mustache is just a little odd. We just aren't used to Count Dracula with a mustache. Certainly not the highway cop one Christopher Lee has in this movie. Do you have any idea how fast you were going? Well, all highway cop mustaches aside, Bram Stoker's Count Dracula never got a U.S. theatrical release, but it did get a U.S. VHS release. 3 of them, in fact. The first one being in 1984 by NTA Home Entertainment, who I had never heard of before and is probably yet another front for child trafficking.
The following disclaimer is for clarification purposes only. The joke you had just heard is in reference to Captain Adam's belief that if a VHS distributor is uncommon and or unheard of, it is therefore a front for child trafficking or a drug ring. For more information on this, please reference the Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship episode, Exercising Exercise Videos. Thank you very much for listening, and we now return to the Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship Hammerfilms Halloween Spectacular, already in progress.
It would be released again in 1989 by Republic Pictures Home Video, who would release it again in 1994. And speaking of VHS distributions, let's get back to Hammer Films. Dracula is, and always has been, an immortal stud, and he would have life eternal on VHS as well. Though all of the Hammer Films Dracula movies were released on VHS, it wouldn't be as frequent or as early as you might think. There are exceptions to that, of course, like the Horror of Dracula was released multiple times, all by Warner Home Video, the first one being in 1985 in the classic Warner Home Video clamshell. And I have this one, actually.
Oh, good for you.
Warner Home Video would release it again in 1989 and in 1993 in identical packaging. And then Warner Home Video would release it again in 1998 as part of their Warner Brothers Hits collection. So the Horror of Dracula, or just Dracula if you'd rather, had a very fruitful life on VHS, but the Brides of Dracula did not, as that only had one VHS distribution, which was in 1992 by MCA Universal Home Video. Dracula, Prince of Darkness would only get one US VHS distribution as well, and that was in 1997 by Anchor Bay as part of their Hammer collection. And I know earlier I said that Anchor Bay did that in 1999, but really they started doing that in 1997. But they did it in 99 as well, so I wasn't wrong. And by the way, out of context, a Hammer collection sounds a bit weird. And if anyone ever asked you to see their Hammer collection, it's probably best to say no.
Hey, you want to see my Hammer collection?
Warner Home Video distributed Dracula Has Risen from the Grave in 1993 and in 1998 as part of their Warner Brothers Hits collection. And you might see a bit of a pattern here because Warner Home Video would release Taste the Blood of Dracula in 93 and in 98 as well. It's a bit interesting that these latter movies didn't get US VHS releases until the early 90s. But the same is not true for Scars of Dracula, as Thorn EMI released it sometime in the 80s. And I say that because they didn't date it. Man, I hate that. It wouldn't be released again until 1994, and that was by Republic Pictures Home Video. It would then be released in 97 by Anchor Bay as part of their, you guessed it, Hammer collection.
Hey, how about you? You want to see my Hammer collection?
No! Anyways, the cinematic cesspool that was Dracula, AD 1972, was released on VHS by Warner Home Video in 1994, and they would release it again in 1998 as part of their, well, you guessed this one too, Warner Brothers Hits Collection.
Hey, you want to see my Warner Brothers Hits Collection?
Maybe. Moving on, The Satanic Rites of Dracula was released on VHS in 1992 by Gemstone Entertainment. Sounds like a child trafficking ring to me. Remember earlier when I said that this movie was released in the US as Count Dracula and His Vampire Bride because The Satanic Rites of Dracula was just a little bit too much for US distributors? Well, the same premise was true for this VHS release because the name was changed to simply The Rites of Dracula. The full name was restored in 1998 when Anchor Bay released it as part of their Hammer collection.
Hey, you want to see?
No! Interesting side note here, one that's sort of related but mostly not related at all, is that Bram Stoker's Count Dracula was a non-Hammer Films Dracula movie that featured Christopher Lee as Dracula. And oddly enough, that wouldn't be the only time that would happen, though it would be the only time he would star as Highway Cop Dracula. You boys ain't from around here, are you? In 1976, he would also portray a non-Hammer Films Dracula in the movie Dracula and Son, which was a French horror comedy, and the actual name I can't pronounce, so you go ahead and try. Enough. This wasn't released in the States until 1979 in a horribly cut up and edited to all hell and terribly overdubbed version that everyone hated. And apparently the actual and original French version is pretty watchable, but we wouldn't know, would we? But on second thought, you could probably actually watch the original French version nowadays, so never mind. But back then, you couldn't. You had to rely on the theatrical release, or later on, the 1988 VHS release by Good Times Home Video. Now, this is a horror comedy about Dracula, which could work, but also could go horribly wrong rather quickly. As in the case for Dracula Dead and Loving It, which, considering it was a Mel Brooks movie that starred Leslie Nielsen, should have been funnier. Yeah, that movie blows, but you know something? I am way off topic here. Now, Dracula is certainly the best known representative of the vampire, but certainly not the only film ambassador of that monster archetype. And this fact would not be lost on Hammer Films as they made a variety of other vampire movies, including, but not limited to, The Kiss of the Vampire, which was released in 1963 and was supposed to be the third installment of the Hammer Films Dracula franchise, which means it was supposed to be a follow-up to The Brides of Dracula, which was the sequel to Dracula. And if you remember, as we talked about earlier, The Brides of Dracula doesn't have Dracula in it. And guess what? Neither does Kiss of the Vampire. Nor did it ever. There was never a version of the screenplay that included Dracula, so that means it's yet another Dracula sequel that doesn't have Dracula in it. Does that make any sense to anybody? Yeah, apparently, at the time of this film's production, there were certain producers at Hammer Films that wanted to get away from Christopher Lee as Dracula. Why on earth would you want that? I mean, that's like shooting yourself in the foot. This is weird to me, considering all the fuss producers would make on making sure Christopher Lee played Dracula in all the Dracula Hammer movies. Of course, that wouldn't be till later on. I mean, I guess they just originally had a different vision, and that vision apparently meant making Dracula movies that didn't have Dracula in them. Call me old-fashioned, but to me, if you're gonna make a Dracula movie, you might want to have Dracula in it. So hearts and minds were changed, and compromises were made, and Kiss of the Vampire became its own little movie, which was still a bit of a follow-up to The Brides of Dracula. So it still ended up being a sequel to a sequel. So there, everybody's happy, I guess. So this is obviously comparable to The Brides of Dracula, as it's supposed to be, considering it's like a little sequel to it. And like The Brides of Dracula, this would also only get one VHS distribution, which wouldn't be until 1995 by MCA Universal Home Video, as part of a collection that a lot of people forget about, and one that I didn't even know they had. Yeah, MCA Universal Home Video had their own little Hammer horror collection. Through the mid-90s, they would release, well, the Hammer Horror Collection. And keep in mind, this was in the middle of them releasing their Universal Monsters Classics Collection, which somehow I always end up talking about. You might be wondering, how is this possible? Why would they do that? How could they do that? Well, Hammerfilms was sort of like an affiliate of Universal Pictures, like a UK affiliate, like partners. You know, they were friends, sort of. Well, I'm glad everyone's buddy-buddy. Anyways, Hammerfilms would continue their non-Dracula vampire movies in 1970 with The Vampire Lovers, which is not the kind of movie you're thinking it is, okay, pal? Well, depending on who you ask and what your definition of that kind of movie is, then maybe it is that kind of movie you're thinking it is. Well, anywho, this is based on an 1872 novella called Carmilla, and this would be the first installment of what is known as the Karnstein trilogy. The other two films were both released in 1971, also by Hammer Films. There was Lust for a Vampire and Twins of Evil. And these films certainly cranked up the babe level, and that's something else Hammer Films would become best known for. Yeah, other than ghastly and ghoulish horror movies, Hammer Films would become synonymous with casting smoking hot chicks, such as Ingrid Pitt. And she would become sort of a horror icon as she starred in numerous non-Hammer horror films, such as 1971's The House That Dripped Blood, which also starred Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Anyways, all three of the films in the Karnstein trilogy were released on VHS with varying degrees of frequency, and their distributors are all over the map. The Vampire Lovers was first released in 1985 by Embassy Home Entertainment. They would release it again in 1988 in packaging that somehow looks older than the 85 distribution, but after that, Orion Home Video would pick up the distribution rights and release it in 1993 with cover art that looks like it should be on the side of a haunted house that's in a traveling carnival. And then later on down the road, MGM Home Entertainment would pick up the distribution rights and release it in the year 2000 as part of their Midnight movie series. Lust for a Vampire wouldn't have as sturgeon of a history on VHS, as it was only released twice. It was first released by Thorn EMI Home Video, and being the cheeky, non-dating bastards that they were, I don't know what year. I don't know, probably 85 if I had to guess, and obviously I do have to guess. It would then be released again in 1993 by Republic Pictures Home Video. Twins of Evil was first released on VHS in 1985 by Vid America Incorporated, who would then release it again in 1988. And actually, Twins of Evil is the most normal of the VHS releases because it stuck with the same distributor, as Vid America Incorporated would release it one final time in 1990. Vampire movies would be an ongoing thing with Hammer Films, especially in 1971, which saw the release of Countess Dracula. Well, actually, despite its obvious title, it's not a Dracula or vampire movie. So no, despite its misleading title, it's not about a female Dracula. But it is a roundabout biopic about the famous Countess Elizabeth Bathory, or rather infamous considering she was famous for mutilating and bathing in the blood of young girls, because she thought it would make her younger, but instead it just got her arrested. So yeah, this film is about that and had no US VHS releases, so let's move on. 1971 also saw the release of another Hammer Films vampire flick, Vampire Circus, which is exactly what it sounds like it is, a circus that has vampires. And like Countess Dracula, this did not get a US VHS release, so we're gonna move on. Another vampire movie in the Hammer library, well, I guess it's not really a vampire movie as it is a vampire hunter movie. Does that count? Well, I guess it does, with Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter, which was released in 1974, and I don't really know if you can consider this a horror movie. I think it's more of an action movie because there's a lot of swashbuckling and well, action and adventure, and plus, look at this guy. This is a guy that's got it all figured out. And in a world of Blades and Van Helsings and Vampire Hunter D's, Captain Kronos is sort of forgotten about as a vampire hunter. But he existed, and he also existed on US VHS releases. And Paramount Home Video would take the reins on this one. They would first release it in 1985, and then continue to release it all through the 90s up until 1999. And in doing what Paramount Home Video does best, they would keep the same sleeve, but use different tapes, which makes it rather hard to collect the one you want. You could get one thinking it's the original 1985 one, only to find out it's from 97. Thanks. 1974 would also see the release of The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, which I had already mentioned earlier, and I know I had said it has nothing to do with Dracula, but it kind of does. So whatever. This film does include a non-Christopher Lee Dracula, but only for a short amount of time. In fact, when this film was first released, there was a version that did not include Dracula at all. Yeah, there were lots of different cuts of this film for some reason, and Hong Kong was the only city that actually released the full version. And when this was released in the US, it was cut to shit and renamed to The Seven Brothers Meet Dracula. And whatever bullshit edit or renamed version of this film you saw, it still boasts the unique accolade of being a martial arts horror movie, which is something you don't see very much of, and dare I say, didn't see at all before the release of this film. It would be released on US VHS as The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires in 1998 by Anchor Bay as part of their Hammer collection.
Hey, I got a Hammer collection too.
I know. Anyways, vampires and the concept of Frankenstein's monster would not be the only monster trope that Hammer Films would tackle. They would also have mummies on their mind and release 4 mummy movies. Now, I've already talked about these films in the episode Mad About Mummy Movies, and you should most certainly check out that episode in its entirety, but I'll give you a little synopsis of the Hammer Films mummy movies. First, there was simply The Mummy from 1959, then Curse of the Mummy's Tomb from 1964, then in 1967 we got The Mummy's Shroud. Hey, I guess that would go good with Scarves of Dracula. And then finally in 1971 we got Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. And for this one, Hammer Films cranked up the babe meter again because it stars Valerie Leon, who was a total smoke show and obviously the selling point of this movie. Because, well, to put it frankly, this movie doesn't have much to do with a mummy. It has to do with the mummy's hand. So there's that. This movie should have been called The Mummy's Hand, but there was already a movie called The Mummy's Hand. Yeah, it's one of the Universal mummy movies from 1940, and that movie actually includes a complete mummy, which is a misleading title because that's the movie that should be about a mummy's hand. But anyways, okay, so Hammer Films tackled vampires, Frankenstein's monsters, and mummies, but what about werewolves? Well, yes, they did, but for only one movie. In 1961, we got The Curse of the Werewolf, which I had already talked about in last year's Halloween special. What about werewolf movies? And again, I'm obligated to say, check it out if you haven't already, and if you have, check it out again. Thank you very much. So Universal Pictures is known for their versions of Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and also Phantom of the Opera. And that character is considered to be one of the Universal Pictures monsters. So, since Hammer Films did their own versions of Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, and even the Wolfman, it's only fitting that they did their own version of Phantom of the Opera. And they did exactly that. And in 1962, The Phantom of the Opera was released. And I'm not taking away from Lon Chaney's iconically ghoulish portrayal of the character, but man, there's just something about the Hammer version that's, I don't know, really unsettling. I guess it's the mask, because it's pretty ghastly. And in typical Hammer Films fashion, they took an old monster trope and brought it to ghoul school. Well, unfortunately, even though it graduated from that honored institution, this is not what you'd call a Hammer Films classic. I mean, technically it is, but emotionally it is not, because people hated this film. It has been described by many movie critics as ornate and dull, which means it looked great, but it was boring, and a lot of people thought it was loosely put together. But the disdain for this movie would be put aside, and it would be released on US VHS. However, only once. It would be released in 1995 by MCA Universal Home Video as part of their Hammer Horror collection. And that's it. I mean, Anchor Bay didn't even touch this one for their Hammer collection. But oh well. A Hammer collection's a Hammer collection, I guess.
You're telling me!
So Hammer Films had a habit of making their own versions of monster movies that Universal Pictures had already done. But sometimes Hammer took a monster trope and said, hey, we're gonna do something you guys haven't. And I'm talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a rather famous, albeit not as popular monster trope that is based on the 1886 novella by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, Universal Pictures didn't do a version of this, but there was already plenty of film adaptations. Yeah, Paramount Pictures did one in 1920 and another one in 1931, and MGM would do one in 1941. And in 1960, Hammer Films would unleash their version onto the world with The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll. And curiously enough, this was released in the US as Jekyll's Inferno, which sounds like a roller coaster at Kennywood. And it was also released as House of Fright for, absolutely no reason. Call it what you want. It's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde movie. And this would not be the only time that Hammer Films used the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde concept, because in 1971, we got Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, which is essentially the same story, but instead of a monster, the serum turns Dr. Jekyll into an evil woman. Boy, I did not see that one coming, and given the title, I was sort of hoping the serum turned him into a nun. Man, I wish that was the case. But it's not. Instead, it's just like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, except it's sort of like Mrs. Doubtfire in a way that's not like Mrs. Doubtfire at all. But anyways, Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Doubtfire, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde was released on VHS in 1994 by Republic Pictures Home Video. And The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll was released on VHS in 1995 by Columbia TriStar Home Video. Moving on, Hammer Films wouldn't be done with monster tropes just yet. They also had zombies on the list, albeit that is a very done-to-death genre nowadays. Back then, it wasn't. And in 1966, we got The Plague of the Zombies. And if you note the year, that is 2 years before Night of the Living Dead came out, which is, of course, the most famous zombie movie. So, once again, Hammer Films was being ahead of the curve, and it has been said that The Plague of the Zombies has been very influential on every zombie movie to date. So really, if it wasn't for this movie, there might not be a Night of the Living Dead. Well, despite its major influence on classic to modern era filmmaking, Plague of the Zombies would only get one US VHS distribution. Yep, only one. Anchor Bay released it as part of their Hammer collection in 1997. Now, when you think of horror movies, what's the first thing you think of? Would it be Sherlock Holmes? Well, Hammer Films thought so, and in 1959 we got The Hound of Baskin-Robbins. Wait, that doesn't sound right. I'm sorry. The Hound of the Baskervilles. Well, wait, that doesn't sound right either. It's Baskervilles, as in more than one? I always thought it was just Baskerville. But it is The Hound of the Baskervilles? Okay, yeah, that's what it is. And as I had said, this is a Sherlock Holmes tale, and it's based on the 1902 novel of the same name. And this movie, being based on a Sherlock Holmes tale, does play out as more of a mystery than a horror movie, but it does have elements of both film genres. In fact, you could say it's like a template for Scooby-Doo. This would first be released on VHS in the US in 1987 by CBS Fox Home Video, and then MGM Home Video would pick up the rights and release it in 93 and in 98 as well. 1959 would also see Hammer Films release The Man Who Could Cheat Death, which, like Countess Dracula, is an anti-aging movie with mad scientist elements. And though it sounds pretty special, this was widely criticized as being tremendously boring. And it seems like it's a horror movie, but nobody told the movie that. And seemingly, no one bothered to put it on VHS. There's no international releases, and there's no US releases. So we're gonna move on, okay? 1961 would see Hammer Films release, I guess you could say a unique horror movie with Shadow of the Cat. Now, right about this time, you might be saying to yourself, ooh, this sounds neat. It's about some kind of werecat thing, right?
Werecat thing, right?
Like maybe the thing Michael Jackson was in the Thriller video. I know he's supposed to be a werewolf, but come on, that's a kitty cat. Maybe Shadow of the Cat is like that. Well, let me spoil your hopes and dreams. Because it's not. Though it is a rather cute and whimsical story for a horror movie. It's about a cat that witnesses its owner's murder and vows to take revenge. Yeah, that's what it's about. And here's the thing. It succeeds. I mean, it's really unique, but also very outlandish, especially considering it's not a cartoon, it's not a kids movie, it's not some zany, wacky comedy, it's a horror movie. I just don't know what to say. I don't know, man. I just can't believe anybody gave this the go-ahead. Well, apparently nobody gave the go-ahead on VHS releases because this doesn't have any either, so let's move on. In 1962, Hammer Films wanted to do something a little different, something unique, something out of left field, because let's face it, once you do a movie about a cat that avenges its owner's death, you've sort of jumped the shark. They wanted to do another horror movie that was based on classic literature, but nothing gothic like Dracula or Frankenstein, and nothing scientific like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They wanted to do a horror movie about a story you really couldn't consider horror at all. Now, really quickly here, let's take a closer look at that concept. It really only takes some minor tweaking to pull that off. With that theory, all you gotta do is this, a little bit of that, hoocha, 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 and bam, Cujo is now Beethoven. Of course, that's the vice versa spectrum of that theory, and Hammer Films would do this with Captain Clay. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, well, now this isn't very obvious. What is he talking about? Well, Captain Clegg is loosely based on the Dr. Sin book series by Russell Thorndike. And this is something that nobody really saw coming because they did, in fact, turn it into a horror movie. Well, horror adventure movie. Now, what's interesting here, perhaps a little bit more interesting than it should be, is that they had to change the names of some of the key characters to avoid copyright infringement from Disney. And what does Disney have to do with all this? Well, they were already set to do a Dr. Sin film, and in 1963 we got The Scarecrow of Romney Marsh, or aka The Scarecrow, Dr. Sin, whatever you want to call it. So during Captain Clegg's production, Disney already had this in the works, and to avoid any kind of legal problem, they just changed some names. And speaking of changing names, when this was released in the US, it was changed to Night Creatures. Now, the whole thing's a decent idea and all that, but it had no VHS releases, so we're gonna move on. Speaking of something a little different, Hammer Films wanted to dabble in the world of science fiction horror once again, and in 1963, they released The Damned, which was actually completed in 61, but was hung up with the censors. Yet British Film Code does not mess around, and this was given the go-ahead, but an X rating, which seems to be their standard reaction to any movie, I guess. Now, The Damned is your archetypal movie about spooky kids before that was a thing. So, again, Hammer Films was ahead of the curve. Technically, these aren't really spooky kids. They're radioactive kids who happen to be spooky, and I'm not sure if that's any better. This would be released in the US, but not until 1965 under the name These Are the Damned. That was a severely cut down version. It was only 77 minutes. That's only a little over an hour. But anyways, this would not have a US VHS release, but it would, however, have a UK VHS release, which I don't typically talk about for the sake of time, but this is interesting because it was released under the US title. Yeah, it was released as These Are the Damned, so it didn't have a US VHS release with that title or the UK title, but it did have a UK VHS release with the US title. That doesn't make a lot of sense, so let's just move on. So again, I ask the question, when you think about horror movies, what's the first thing you think of? No, it's not Sherlock Holmes this time, but would it be Greek mythology? Well, though that might not be the number one answer, it should be on the list because Greek mythology pulsates and undulates with hideous monsters. And one of those monsters is the Gorgon. What's a Gorgon? The best representative of a Gorgon is Medusa. We all know her, right? And the Gorgon, as a species, is a very major monster in Greek mythology. And Hammer Films thought very highly of this monster, and in 1964, they released The Gorgon. Remember earlier, like 1,000 hours ago, when I was talking about how Hammer Films would use monsters that people typically didn't? You know, like abominable snowman and radioactive blobs. Well, you can add a Gorgon to that list because nobody did a movie about a Gorgon, and no one else seemingly would until 1981 with the release of Clash of the Titans, which of course is the best known example of a Gorgon on film, but a lot of people forget that Hammer Films did it first. The Gorgon is tremendously revered as being massively underrated, and this movie monster herself is an unsung hero. And in a world of Dracula's, Frankenstein's monsters, and mummies and stuff, the Gorgon should be right on that list. And if you're a VHS collector, it should be on your list as well. It was first released on US VHS by RCA Columbia Pictures Home Video in 1984. They would release it again in 1987 in identical packaging. The only difference is the cassette. As you can see, the labels are different. And in 1988, Good Times Home Video would have their own VHS release of it. And look at this cover art. I mean, it's not bad, but once again, I'm reminded of a traveling carnival. And this would definitely be the artwork on one of those octopus rides. So, at this juncture in the episode, you've more than likely gotten a grip on what Hammer Horror is all about. It's an extensive cinemascape that ranges from classic monster archetypes like Dracula or the Mummy, Phantom of the Operas, Wolfmen, Frankenstein's monsters, and vampire lesbians, to non-typical monsters like abominable snowmen and gorgons, to unlikely horror concepts like Sherlock Holmes or Dr. Sin, and onward to surprisingly spooky stuff like radioactive kids or vengeful house cats. Yeah, I'm still trying to get my head around that one. But historical figures would also come into play, and in 1966, Rasputin, the Mad Monk, was unleashed onto the world. And as the title implies, it's about Rasputin, or Rasputin if you're nasty. And Christopher Lee, who has so far portrayed Hammer versions of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy, would up his acting ante and portray rootin' tootin' Rasputin, though the poster makes him look like a cross between Dave Grohl and Bruiser Brody. Okay, so like, you know how movies used to do these gimmicks where if you went to go see it, you got something special to watch the movie with, like, I don't know, 3D glasses? Well, this one gave you a beard. Yes, this was real life. You got a fake beard when you went to go see Rasputin. Oh man, this is taking gimmicks to a whole new level, and I really like it, and I really wish a lot more movies did this. Well, anyways, this would go on to have a US VHS release, though you would have had to supply your own fake beard. Oh man, what a ripoff! This was released in 1997 by Anchor Bay as part of their Hammer collection. You know, all this gothic horror stuff and vengeful kitty cats and vampire lesbians, it's all fine and good, but sometimes, just sometimes, you want to watch a movie that's about a mutant lizard woman. Well, Hammer Films felt the same way. In 1966, we got The Reptile. And this is indeed that, because it's a lizard woman. And this is also another underrated movie monster. I mean, just look at that. Now that's a movie monster. This movie was well received and widely regarded as a superb piece of 60s horror. It has also been described as stylish and moody and surprisingly tasteful for a movie that's about a mutant lizard woman. Well, despite all the praise and accolades, this would only get one US VHS distribution in 1997 by Anchor Bay as part of their, guess what?
Oh, don't I know it, buddy?
Moving on, 1966 was a very loaded year for Hammer horror, and that year would yield the release of Dracula, Prince of Darkness, The Plague of the Zombies, and, as we've just talked about, Rasputin, The Mad Monk, and The Reptile. And it would also see the release of The Witches, which was released in the States as The Devil's Own, which didn't have any VHS distribution, so we're gonna move on. It's also rather or vaguely important to note that 1966 would also see the release of 1 Million Years BC, which isn't horror, but one of Hammer Films' more important movies. Yeah, it was pretty popular and would help further cement Hammer Films into cinema history. Not to mention, it starred Raquel Welch, who helped many a young lad get through puberty. And since we're talking about it, this did have a US VHS release. It was released in 1994 by 20th Century Fox Home Video. 1967 wouldn't have quite as fruitful of a horror harvest that 1966 did, but Hammer Films would still manage to squeeze out a couple. You had Frankenstein Created Woman and The Mummy's Shroud. And Hammer Films would not only return to their sci-fi horror roots, but also continue the Quatermass saga as well, with the release of Quartermass and The Pit, which was released in the States as 5 Million Years to Earth. But it would be released on US VHS under its original title in 1999 by Anchor Bay as part of their Hammer collection. And if you haven't guessed by now, Anchor Bay was very important to Hammer Films horror, as it would be the only US VHS bastion of some of these movies.
Hey, Hammer collections are important.
Apparently they are. And it's important to note here that though I do plan on doing an episode about prehistoric fantasy films in the future, it's presently worth mentioning Hammer Films' contribution to that film genre. Because, like horror movies, they would make a shitload of those too, and most of the time they would coincide with the release of said horror movies. The pinnacle years for this would be through the 60s and 70s, and every year that would have a Hammer horror movie released, which was pretty much all of them, there was also a Hammer prehistoric fiction movie. They would first delve into prehistoric fantasy with the release of She in 1965. And that's interesting and counteractive to my point because there weren't any Hammer horror movies released in 65. Unless you count psychological thrillers as horror movies, in that case there was a shitload released in 65. And by shitload, I mean 3. There was Fanatic, which was released as Die, Die, My Darling in the States, Hysteria, and The Nanny, which, trust me, has nothing to do with Fran Drescher. There was 1 Million Years BC in 66, which we already talked about. In 67, there was Slave Girls, which was released in the States as Prehistoric Women, and is sort of a follow-up to 1 Million Years BC. But to get back to Hammer horror, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about, 1968 was an okay year. It wasn't nearly as loaded as the previous years had been, but it did see the release of Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. But if yet another Dracula movie wasn't your thing and you wanted to see a horror movie about the occult, well, Hammer Films had you covered with the release of The Devil Rides Out, which was based on the 1934 novel of the same name by Dennis Wheatley. This was released in the States as The Devil's Bride, but it would be released on US VHS under its original title. And the only one of those was from 1998 by Anchor Bay as part of their Hammer collection. So Hammer did 2 horror movies in '68, but they would also do 2 prehistoric fiction movies. There was The Vengeance of She, which is a loose sequel to She. And then there was The Lost Continents, which is based on another novel by Dennis Wheatley, Uncharted Seas. 1969 wasn't all that busy or exciting for Hammer Films. They would only release Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed and the science fiction epic Moon Zero 2. So 69 sort of sucked, but 1970 would more than make up for it, especially if you were a fan of Dracula and or vampire movies. But we already talked about them. It was Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scarves of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, and The Vampire Lovers. And they squeezed a Frankenstein movie in there too with The Horror of Frankenstein. And if the line between horror movies and psychological thrillers is far too thin for you, well, they also had Crescendo. And as if that weren't enough for 1 year, Hammer Films would release When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. And 71 was very loaded as well. We had Lust for a Vampire, Vampire Circus, Countess Dracula, Twins of Evil, Blood from the Mummy's Shroud. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. God, it's so easy to get this stuff mixed up. There was also the horror masterpiece of Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. But then there was also Hands of the Ripper, which sounds like an Iron Maiden song. This one's called Hands of the Ripper! Which you may have guessed from the movie's title that it's about Jack the Ripper. Well, not really. It's about his fictional daughter. Yep, the old apple didn't fall far from the tree as she continues his fiendish killing spree. It's a very interesting concept and a rather well done film, but it only had 1 US VHS distribution. And no, surprisingly, it wasn't from Anchor Bay this time. It was from good old Vid America Incorporated. And they would release it in 1985, and that's it. So 71 was a pretty primo year for Hammer Films, and they would even pry a prehistoric fiction movie in there with Creatures the World Forgot. 1971, great year for Hammer. 1972, not so much. 72 didn't do dick for Hammer horror movies. There was Dracula AD 1972, but geez, you might as well not even bother. But again, if psychological thrillers fit into your definition of horror movies, then there was a lot of those. Well, 3. There was Fear in the Night, Straight On Till Morning, and Demons of the Mind. 72 kind of sucked. There wasn't even any prehistoric fiction movies. 73 kind of sucked too. There was only The Satanic Rites of Dracula. 74 was okay. It had Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. And it also had The Legend of the 7 Golden Vampires, but alas, no prehistoric fiction or even any psychological thrillers. And by this time, it was pretty clear that old Hammer Films was entering its twilight. They didn't release any movies at all in 75, and in 76, they only released 1. And I'm not talking about just 1 horror movie, I'm talking about 1 movie, period. But that 1 movie just happened to be a horror movie, and it was called To the Devil, a Daughter. And this is based on yet another novel by Dennis Wheatley. Man, they were, big fans of his work, I guess. This movie has been described as a lackluster occult melodrama, and that's something you just don't hear every day. Well, all creative criticism aside, this would have a very extensive life on VHS, but mainly by distributors that were probably child traffickers. Continental Video would release it in 1984. Planet Video would release it sometime in the 80s, no date given. Who the hell is Planet Video? What kind of nefarious things were they up to? And then in 1988, it would be released by Cinema Group Home Video. The hell is that, child traffickers? And then finally, somebody we know, Republic Pictures Home Video, would release it in 1994. And then that's it. That is the last original era Hammer horror film ever produced. But Hammer Films would rage against the dying of the light, and in 1979, they would release their final feature film, The Lady Vanishes, which is not a horror movie, it's a mystery comedy, but it's noteworthy because it's the last Hammer Films movie. Well, original era Hammer Films, at least, and I'll get to that. When the 80s rolled around, Hammer Films did nothing. They remained dormant all the way up to the early 2000s when they were bought out by a conglomerate, or a consortium consortium, whatever you want to call it. I'm not really going to get into that. The show is too long anyway. And in the year 2008, they started cranking out movies again. So there you go. There's original era Hammer films and modern era Hammer films. I'm sure they're fine, but I'm not going to get into it. It's not really my thing. In closing, I'm glad they still exist and are still making movies, but it's not really the same, is it? But that's okay, because it's not meant to be. There was a time and place for the original era Hammer films, and we had that. And we still do, and we can always revisit them. But you know, as far as modern era Hammer films go, well, sometimes goodbye is the only way. Sometimes dead is better. Yeah, Hammer films had its place in time, and it was great. Well, I mean, not all of it was good, obviously, but even at their schlockiest, they were still classy. Hammer films is tremendously important, not just to horror or psychological thrillers or prehistoric adventures, but to the world of cinema in general. And though they're mainly known for their horror movies, they did all kinds of stuff. They ran the total gamut of film genre. But let's face it, they're probably not going to be remembered for 1972's Mutiny on the Buses. Yeah, it's the horror, it's the sci-fi stuff, it's the prehistoric adventures, it's the psychological thrillers. It's that stuff that made them exciting, because they were fun, and at the time, the concepts they were laying out were pretty new. They were pioneers. I mean, they made one of the first zombie movies, one of the first Gorgon movies, one of the first Abominable Snowman movies, the first movie about a radioactive blob, and well, there was even a movie about radioactive kids. And even something as lighthearted and seemingly silly as a vengeful house cat was still unique and groundbreaking. They would revamp old monster movie concepts and make them stylish and ghastly like the Phantom of the Opera. They gave us new genres of film like martial arts horror or prehistoric fantasy. And man, oh man, did they do gothic horror just right. Hammer films always did a masterful job of instilling an air of uneasiness. Even if a movie was bad, it was still spooky. It always gave you the heebie-jeebies, which is a lot different than the heebie-bee-jees. Hammer films was a monumental pioneer of cinema, and nobody did it like they did. If you're a horror fan or just a fan of movies in general and haven't delved into Hammer films, well, do yourself a favor and correct that immediately. But let it be known that these films should be taken with a grain of salt, and don't expect some highfalutin action movie, because the pacing can be slow and plotting at times, but that's what filmmaking was back then. They should be enjoyed for what they are, and all I'm saying is don't watch Hellraiser 2, then watch Dracula Has Risen from the Grave and expect the same result. But at the end of the day, I believe everyone should have a Hammer collection.
You're right as rain, buddy.
So thank you very much for coming along with me on this great Halloween adventure. So be sure to hit subscribe, and if you like what you see, throw me a bone on Patreon and join the Skeleton Crew. It's cheap, there's lots of exclusive content, and you get a free sticker. Thank you very much for watching. Take care out there, and I'll see you next time, only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.
Happy Halloween, everybody.